Linda Gottlieb. She's a New York licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed clinical social worker. She's trained by the world-renowned psychiatrist Salvador Minuchin. She began her work in New York foster care program, followed by working with children with psychiatric issues at the South Shore Child Guidance Center in Long Island. Later, she took assignments from local family courts. After writing her book in 2012 on parental alienation, she focused her clinical practice on parental alienation. Working with over 650 alienated children in 2015, she began an intensive reunification intervention program called Turning Point. Thank you very much, Ms. Gottlieb.
I'd like to thank Representative Gonzalez for putting this together and honoring me with the opportunity to speak to you. I've been in a therapeutic role working with children and families for 50 years or half a century, whichever makes me appear younger. I've testified as an expert witness in more than 22 states around the country in more than 37 jurisdictions as a qualified expert in all aspects of family dynamics and family therapy and child custody. And every issue that I've heard today about Connecticut, I think applies to every state that I've testified in. In these matrimonial cases, everybody extols the standard of the best interests of the child, and everywhere it is ignored. And in particular, it's ignored in reference to a child's meaningful, ongoing relationship with two parents. In matrimonial cases, this is really a travesty. And yet, there is one aspect that is heard, one type of case that is heard in family court, in which the child has a right to both parents. And what you have to do to get that privilege is to be adjudicated an abusive or neglectful parent. Because by federal foster care mandates, an abused, neglectful, or an adjudicated abused or neglectful parent has a mandated right to weekly visits with their child. A mandated right. Mandated right to be consulted in medical treatment before the agency signs for it. Even a school trip. How is it possible that at 9 a.m., the judge in family court is admonishing the agency because they failed to make diligent efforts to require that weekly visit with the abusive parent, and at 9:15, the judge is ignoring the parenting plan of a loving, fit parent? It absolutely makes no sense to me. To me, this is really schizophrenic behavior, and I really don't understand it. What did I learn from 3,000 abused and neglected foster children who I worked with over the years before transitioning into mental health? Number one, I learned that these children don't even reject an abusive parent. They minimized the abuse, they protected that parent. Mommy didn't break my arm, fell off a swing. Daddy didn't burn me, I was reaching over the stove for a cookie. I learned that the instinct for a parent is part of the instinct for survival because of our long dependency period. We need to change the standard of burden of proof. In matrimonial cases, when you are faced with the situation of a child rejecting a parent, to me, the burden should be to prove that alienation is not the cause, rather than it is the cause. That's what I learned from these children. So what do we do instead in matrimonial cases? We elevate the voice of the child. We have literally put the child in charge of the family court system and the family. It makes absolutely no sense to me. Could you imagine, what other system do we do that? Should we put the child in charge of the local pharmacy? Should we put the child in charge of medical decisions? How about in organizing the school? Why do we do this? I do not understand this. We have all the research that children do not understand what it means to have a parent absent from their lives. They don't know what's in their own best interests. And yet we've elevated that voice across the country and in most Western democracies to that position. What is the problem with that? Well, number one, we have all this research on how easy it is to implant a memory. Elizabeth Loftus has shown in her studies that it only takes 3 consecutive weekly sessions to convince a child that they were lost in the mall, that they took a balloon ride. What really shocked me as to how easy it is to influence a child is research by Julia Shore, a Harvard researcher. She did research that with college students, she was able to convince a large segment, I'll tell you in a minute, that when they were teenagers they had committed a crime. Now I think most of us in this audience, given our relationship to the law, would be pretty hard-pressed to believe that just a few years before we were in college we had committed a crime. Well, that's what the research found after 3 weekly interviews, that they had beat up their best friend to such a degree that the police were called. How is that possible with a stranger? Now imagine how these children, dependent on a parent, are so easily convinced and buy into whatever stories they have told about the other parent. And these children are now repeating it very convincingly to their lawyer, to the court. I mean, years ago I wrote an article on my website. It wasn't peer-reviewed. I think I should submit it now with what I know. An alienated child could pass a lie detector test. I really do believe that at this point. They sound so credible. And this is what we're relying on in the court system. Now, in that wonderful book that I love by Clower and Rivlin, published by the American Bar Association, Children Held Hostage, Identifying Brainwashed Children, Presenting a Case, and Crafting Solutions, page 420, table 17, they found that 86% of children whose parents were going through a high conflict situation, they followed 1,000 children for 34 years. 700 of the children were in custody disputes. The other 300 were other parental conflicts. 86% of them were subjected to some degree of brainwashing. 86%. And we are now ignoring this evidence and listening to the voice of the child. I can tell you, of the 650 alienated children I worked with over the years, most of them were severely alienated because most of my referrals did come from the local courts. They were fairly severe. I would have to say that there was at least one false child abuse case knowingly made in virtually 100% of the severe cases. 100%, virtually. A lot of them sex abuse. Now, when I come to this afternoon, I want to give some testimony about what happens to children and the statistics on children who falsely believe that they had been sexually abused by a parent. It is horrific. And this is what we're doing to our kids. And I find it extremely dangerous. And I think we need to really start taking a situation and evaluating these children. These children present nothing like the abused and neglected children that I actually worked with. And we need to really make a field of specialists who can come in there and really educate the court, because these children are growing up to be severely damaged.